Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much. Hope you enjoy your tour.
First thing I need to tell you folks is that it was politics that drove me to my grave. And by the way, my actual grave is just across the road. You'll pass it as you're walking away from here. You'll notice Bell on the front of it. Maybe some of you wonder, who in the world is John Bell? Well, amongst other things, I ran for president against Abraham Lincoln. And if I'd been elected president, there would have been no war. Permit me to tell you a bit about myself. My grandfather settled in these parts in 1783. He fathered 19 children. I was born in 1796, and I grew up not too far from here, out off Old Nolensville Pike. As a youngster, I always enjoyed reading and just thinking. I ended up attending Cumberland College. Now, the nation wasn't much older than I was at that time, but the nation was so full of itself and pride over having stood up to the British the way they did. Now, the South was filled with a sense of nationalism. The state capital was over in Knoxville in those days. There wasn't any West Tennessee. There was no Memphis. In fact, west of Nashville, which was the frontier, was just nothing but Indians. 2 years out of college, I made a decision to run for the state senate. Now, maybe I should have run from it. That began what was a long and very difficult career for me in politics. I believe that we should have fine colleges and universities, and I thought that the states ought to fund them. It was concerns over funding issues that then prompted me in 1826 to make a run for the United States Congress. I defeated Felix Grundy. You just walk past Mr. Grundy's tomb right over here at the corner. It was the vote of Nashville's white aristocracy and the free blacks in the area that got me elected. Did you know that fully 25% of all the blacks in this area were free at that time? And you know what? They sent a band over to serenade me after the election. I always appreciated that. In Congress, I believe that we should operate with a balanced budget. I believe we should take care of debts and obligations first, and then any monies that were left over would be applied to schools and to roads. But that Congress was not to make the decisions in those matters. Any monies that were left over to be sent back to the states where the money came from to begin with. You have to understand that internal improvements are outside the pale of congressional authority. In a speech I made before Congress in 1829 regarding the Cumberland Road Bill, I advised the congressman that the U.S. Constitution did not give Congress the authority to establish a system of roads. Well, one of the gentlemen piped up and said, well, what if a state gives the right-of-way? I said, no, sir. A state cannot add to the powers of the general government. The danger seemed obvious to me as well. The states would start looking toward the general government as the dispenser of money. The federal government would become everything and the states would become nothing. Well, by 1832, it was pretty obvious that we had a very hungry general government on our hands. And the only real income came from tariff monies. We didn't have any income tax yet. Mr. Lincoln and his Yankee cohorts would in due time take care of that issue. South Carolina nullified the high tariff law. President Andrew Jackson had to threaten South Carolina. Finally, a compromise was agreed upon on a slightly lower tariff. But honestly, had it not been for cooler heads like Mr. Clay and Mr. Calhoun, South Carolina would have seceded from the Union right then in 1832. Well, nearly 3 decades later, these constitutional issues still remain. That's when I decided, I actually agreed to run for president under the banner of a new party called the Constitutional Union Party. I carried 3 states, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia. Mr. Breckinridge carried the rest of the South, and of course Mr. Lincoln carried the North. Were you aware Abraham Lincoln's name wasn't even on the ballot in the South? I believe that such a regional candidacy as his could only lead to secession. And I also believe the choice of Abraham Lincoln to be president was done so with a callous disregard for the consequences. Well, Mr. Lincoln himself had said before Congress in a speech in 1847, he said, any people have a right at any time to rise up and throw off the current government. and set up one that is more to their own liking? Well, the South took him up on that. The first state to go was South Carolina. Then all the Gulf states from Florida across to Texas seceded. In February of '61, Tennessee voted to remain in the United States. We believed secession was legal, we just weren't quite as upset about things as the other states were. In March of '61, I made my way off to Washington City to attend Mr. Lincoln's inauguration. And while I was there, I had a meeting with Mr. Lincoln, at which time I advised him that I thought the best course of action was just to let them go in peace. And I came back to Tennessee thinking Mr. Lincoln was going to adopt a pacifistic policy in the matter, only to discover later that behind the scene all the while, Mr. Lincoln had been conspiring to reinforce Fort Sumter. 5 months after secession, South Carolina finally lost her patience and opened fire. Now, we weren't all that upset to learn that South Carolina had opened fire at Fort Sumter, but when word came that Mr. Lincoln expected Tennessee to provide troops to invade the Confederacy, that did it. Never seen attitudes change so fast, I mean overnight. Governor Harris sent word back to Mr. Lincoln, Tennessee will not provide one single man for the purposes of coercion. So Tennessee seceded from the Union. And I believe we had every right to do so. Perhaps my sentiments might best be expressed by the words of General Robert E. Lee, who was quoted as saying, "A nation held together by a bayonet holds no charm to me." I thank you for your time. Good evening.